She's still breathing, Jack bellowed into the freezing dark, his voice cracking raw against the Montana wind. Below the guardrail, flames crawled up twisted metal, and somewhere inside that burning wreckage, a woman in a white wedding dress was still alive, 8 months pregnant, alone, and whispering something that turned Jack Sullivan's blood to ice. Not the cold, not the fire, but 3 words that changed everything. He pushed us. If you've never heard a pregnant woman beg a stranger not to let someone take her baby, consider yourself lucky. Jack Sullivan hadn't either. Until that morning. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The call had come at 2:47 in the morning. Not a phone call, not a radio transmission, nothing official, nothing dispatched, nothing logged in any county record. Just the sound of squealing tires somewhere ahead in the darkness. Then a crash so violent it shook the mountain itself, and then worst of all, silence. 22 motorcycles had been running in tight formation along Highway 12, heading southwest out of the Bitterroot Range, the kind of formation that had taken years to perfect, the kind that became second nature when you'd ridden alongside the same men through every season of life. Jack Sullivan rode point. He always rode point. Not because anyone told him to, he was the president. He didn't need to be told anything, but because he believed that a man who leads should see what's coming before anyone else does. They had buried Danny Cortez that afternoon in a cemetery outside Missoula. Danny had been 41 years old, pancreatic cancer, 6 weeks from diagnosis to burial. He'd ridden his last mile in a pine box, flanked by 22 brothers in leather, and the only thing Jack had managed to say at the graveside was that Danny had been the best kind of man, the kind who never once made you feel like you owed him anything, even when you owed him everything. The ride home was supposed to be quiet. It was supposed to be the kind of night where nobody talked, where the engines did the grieving, where the road just carried you forward because forward was the only direction that existed anymore. Jack saw the guardrail first. It was bent outward at a 45-degree angle, fresh metal gleaming under his headlight, the kind of damage that doesn't come from weather or a slow drift that comes from impact. Serious impact. He lifted his left fist and the entire column slowed behind him before he'd even consciously decided to stop. He pulled to the shoulder and killed his engine. The others followed without a word. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. 22 men sat on their machines in the dark and not one of them spoke because they could all smell it. Burning rubber, hot metal, and something else underneath that, something chemical and wrong. "Smoke," said Hector Ruiz from the second position, his voice flat and certain. "I see it," Jack said. He was already off his bike. He crossed the broken guardrail in 2 strides and looked down the ravine. The vehicle, an SUV, black or dark blue. It was hard to tell through the flames, had come to rest against a cluster of rocks, maybe 60 feet below the road. The front end had absorbed the worst of it. The windshield was gone. One door hung open at an angle that suggested it had been opened before the crash, not blown open by impact. The fire was working its way up the passenger side. "Call 911, Jack said over his shoulder, not looking back. "All of you, every phone. I don't care if it goes to voicemail, you keep calling." "Jack, call." He went down the embankment without a light. He knew that was reckless. He also knew there was someone alive in that vehicle because the smoke was moving wrong, not just rising from the fire, but agitated, disturbed the way smoke moves when something inside is still generating heat and motion and breath. He was 15 feet away when he heard it. Not a scream, not exactly, more like the sound a person makes when they're trying to scream, but don't have enough air left to produce the full thing. A compressed, desperate animal sound. The sound of a human being fighting to stay in the world. Jack broke into a run. He hit the passenger's side door with his shoulder, and it gave more easily than he expected. Swinging wide, and the heat that rolled out was immediate and serious. He turned his face to the side, shielded his eyes with his forearm, and looked into the cabin. She was in the passenger seat. She was wearing a white dress. He registered the dress before anything else, the white fabric now torn and stained dark, the kind of formal dress a woman wears on a specific day of her life, a once-in-a-lifetime day. And then his brain caught up with the rest of what he was seeing, and his stomach dropped straight through the floor of the world. She was pregnant, visibly, undeniably, heavily pregnant. 8 months at least, maybe more. Her hands were pressed against the lower half of her abdomen in a posture that wasn't fear. It was protection. even half-conscious, even bleeding from a gash above her left eye that had painted the side of her face red. Even with the fire climbing the doorframe behind her, her instinct was to protect what was inside her. "Ma'am?" Jack reached in and touched her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me? I'm going to get you out. Don't fight me, just let me—" Her eyes opened. They were blue. Clear, sharp blue, the kind of eyes that belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime paying attention to things that mattered. And for 1 second, those eyes focused on his face with an intensity that had nothing to do with confusion or shock. She was looking at him the way a person looks at someone when they are deciding whether or not that person can be trusted. She made the decision fast. "Baby," she whispered. "Is the baby—" "I don't know yet," Jack said. "I need to get you out first. Can you move your legs?" She tried. He saw the effort move through her body, watched her jaw tighten, and her breath go shallow and ragged, and he understood immediately that she couldn't do this on her own. "It's okay," he said. "I've got you. I'm going to lift you. When I do, I need you to put your arms around my neck if you can. If you can't, that's fine too. Just hold on." "Please," she said, and the word came out broken and small, almost too quiet to hear over the growing sound of the fire. "Please don't let him take my baby." Jack went very still. It was the word "him" that stopped him. Not the crash, not "I'm hurt" or "help me" or anything that pointed toward accident or coincidence. She had said him, a specific person, a person she was afraid of, a person she expected might be coming. "Who?" Jack said. "Who are you talking about?" Her mouth moved. Her eyes were drifting, losing focus, the blood loss and the shock and the cold all pulling her toward unconsciousness. He watched her fight it, watched her drag herself back to the surface of awareness by sheer will, by some deep and furious refusal to go under before she said what she needed to say. "My husband," she whispered. "He pushed us off the cliff." A pause, a long shuddering breath. "He's coming back." Then her eyes closed. Jack had been in dangerous situations before. He had ridden through riots and survived ambushes and sat across tables from men who wanted him dead and kept his expression neutral and his hand steady. He was not a man who panicked. Panic was a luxury for people who didn't understand how bad things could actually get. But standing in that burning ravine, holding a bleeding, pregnant woman in his arms, with those words still hanging in the frozen mountain air, "He pushed us off the cliff. He's coming back." Jack Sullivan felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt afraid, not for himself. He had stopped being afraid for himself somewhere around age 30. But for this woman, for the child she was carrying, for the fact that she had looked at him with those clear blue eyes and trusted him with the most important information she had left, he felt a fear that was sharp and cold and absolutely clarifying. He pulled her free of the vehicle. She was lighter than he expected, which told him she'd been through something long before tonight. Not just the crash, but months of something that had quietly taken from her. He got his arms under her and carried her up the embankment the same way he'd come down, not carefully, not gracefully, just efficiently, because the fire was getting louder behind him, and efficiency was what was needed. Hector was waiting at the top with his phone already out. "Ambulance is 12 minutes out," he said. Then he saw the woman in Jack's arms, and he stopped talking entirely. "Get me a blanket," Jack said. "Somebody get me a blanket right now." 3 men moved at once. A road blanket appeared, one of those heavy wool things that lived in a saddlebag and never seemed necessary until the exact moment it was absolutely necessary, and Jack lowered the woman to the ground and wrapped it around her as carefully as he knew how, which was not very carefully, because he was a biker and not a nurse, but he tried. "Here's the name," said a voice from behind him. It was Marcus Webb, the club's oldest active member, 63 years old, a former Army medic who had ridden with the club for 30 years, and who in moments of genuine crisis became the calmest person in any room. "Check her for ID. We need her name." Jack checked. There was a small purse tangled in the folds of her dress, barely held there by a thin strap. Inside it, a phone, a lip balm, a folded receipt from a grocery store, and a wallet. Inside the wallet, a driver's license. Grace Eleanor Walker, age 31, Blackwood Falls address. "Grace," Jack said, leaning close to her. "Grace, can you hear me? My name is Jack. You're out of the vehicle. You're safe. The ambulance is coming." She didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow but present, and Marcus had his fingers on her wrist, counting his lips moving slightly. Pulse is weak, but it's there, Marcus said. She's losing blood from the head wound. Could be internal injury. Could be the baby. I can't tell without equipment. How bad? Marcus met his eyes. We need that ambulance to be 12 minutes and not 13. Jack looked up the highway. The road was empty in both directions. The mountain was dark and still and indifferent the way mountains always are when human beings are suffering below them. He looked down at Grace Walker, at the white dress, at the ring on her finger, a gold band with a diamond that caught the firelight and threw it back in pieces, at her hands still pressed instinctively against her abdomen, even now, even unconscious. He pushed us off the cliff. He's coming back. Martinez, Jack said without looking up. A young man stepped forward, 24 years old, quick, never asked unnecessary questions. Yeah. I need you to go back down there, and I need you to look at that vehicle. Don't touch anything. I mean anything. Don't open a door. Don't move a piece of debris. Just look, and then come back and tell me what you see. Martinez didn't ask why. He nodded and went over the guardrail. The rest of you, Jack said, raising his voice enough to reach the whole group, spread out. Both directions on the highway. 50-yard intervals. Anyone comes down this road in the next 12 minutes, I want to know about it. You think someone's actually coming? Hector asked. She said so. That was enough. The men moved without argument, without complaint, taking up positions along the highway the way they'd learned to position themselves over years of riding together intuitively, efficiently, without needing to be told twice. 22 men becoming something purposeful in the dark. Jack stayed with Grace. He stayed on one knee beside her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, and he talked to her. He didn't know if she could hear him. He didn't know if it helped, but he remembered reading somewhere years ago that hearing was the last thing to go when consciousness faded and the first thing to come back, and so he talked. He told her the ambulance was coming. He told her the baby was going to be okay. He told her, quietly and without flourish, that nobody was going to touch her or that child while he was standing there. He didn't know at the time how big a promise that was. He kept it anyway. Martinez came back up the embankment 4 minutes later. His face was carefully neutral in the way that faces get when the person wearing them is trying not to show that they are genuinely disturbed. Talk to me, Jack said. Driver's side airbag deployed, Martinez said. Passenger side didn't. Jack was quiet for a moment. That's so. Seatbelt on the passenger side, it's cut. Not frayed, not snapped, under impact, cut. Blade or something similar. Clean through the housing. Jack looked down at Grace. Steering wheel's positioned wrong, Martinez continued. Driver's seat is shoved way back. Whoever was driving that thing, their legs were a lot longer than hers. She's 5'4" on the license. Yeah, this driver was 6 foot minimum, maybe more. You said don't touch anything. I didn't touch anything. I'm telling you what I could see. Martinez paused. There's also no purse on the driver's side, no jacket, no personal items, like someone cleaned out before they walked away. Jack stood up. He turned and looked down the highway east in the direction the vehicle would have come from, in the direction someone on foot might have gone if they'd had somewhere to go and someone to call before the bikers arrived. Hector. Yeah. When the ambulance comes, we're all going to that hospital. Hector blinked. Jack, it's 4 a.m. We just buried Danny. We've got all of us, every single one. Jack's voice was quiet and certain, the voice he used when the decision had already been made and he was simply informing the world of it. She doesn't have anyone, and someone tried to kill her. He looked at Hector steadily. We're not leaving her alone. Hector opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Grace on the ground, at the ring on her finger, at the white dress, at the slow rise and fall of her chest. All right, he said. The ambulance arrived at 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The paramedics came out fast and professional, and Jack stepped back immediately to let them work. He watched them assess Grace with the same quiet efficiency that Marcus had shown, moving with purpose, attaching monitors, cutting away fabric to check for injuries he hadn't been able to see in the dark. He heard the words fetal heartbeat and C-section and trauma unit, and he filed each one away without reacting to it outwardly. One paramedic, a young woman with her hair pulled back tight, looked up at him. You pulled her out of the vehicle? Yes. Any movement or sensation in her legs when you did? She tried to move them, couldn't. The paramedic wrote something down. Was she conscious, in and out? She said a few sentences. What kind of sentences? Jack held the paramedic's gaze. The kind that need to go to police. Something shifted in the young woman's expression. She looked at Grace, then back at Jack, then at the group of bikers spread out along the highway behind him. He could see her doing the math that everyone did when they encountered 22 Hell's Angels on a mountain road at 4 in the morning, running the calculation, deciding how much of what they were seeing could be trusted. We're coming to the hospital, Jack said. All of us. I just want you to know that ahead of time so nobody's surprised. You can't. I know what we can and can't do at a hospital. We'll stay in the waiting room. We won't interfere with anything, but we're not leaving until she has someone to leave her with. Another long look. Fine, the paramedic said and turned back to her work. They loaded Grace into the ambulance with the efficiency and controlled urgency that Jack had always found both impressive and deeply unsettling, the way people who deal with emergencies professionally can be simultaneously calm and absolutely frantic, the way they make urgency look like routine. The doors closed, the lights came on. Jack watched the ambulance pull away, heading toward Blackwood Falls General, 12 miles down the mountain. He turned to his men. Mount up, he said. Nobody asked questions. 22 engines came to life in sequence, and the column reformed on the highway, and they followed the ambulance down the mountain, the same way they had ridden in from the funeral that afternoon in tight formation, together, each man exactly where he was supposed to be. The hospital parking lot at 4:30 in the morning was quiet. 22 motorcycles are not quiet. By the time the column came to a stop near the emergency entrance, 3 security guards had appeared at the sliding doors, and Jack could see a 4th one on his radio inside. He didn't react to this. He killed his engine, kicked the stand, and walked toward the entrance with his hands visible, because he'd learned a long time ago that visible hands were the first and most important message you could send to a nervous person. We're here for the woman who just came in, he told the nearest guard. The pregnant woman from the crash on 12. Are you family? No. Then you'll need to. I know, we're going to sit in the waiting room. I just want you to know we're here and why. The guard looked past Jack at the 21 men standing beside their machines in the parking lot. He looked back at Jack. Whatever he had been about to say seemed to lose conviction somewhere in the middle of the journey. Waiting room is through those doors, he said. No more than 3 at a time in the corridor. Understood, Jack said. He went inside. The waiting room was the kind of space that existed only in emergency departments, in airports, fluorescent anonymous, designed to be endured rather than inhabited. A television mounted to the wall was showing a home shopping channel. 3 plastic chairs held 3 separate people in 3 separate varieties of exhaustion. Jack sat down. Marcus came in and sat beside him. Hector came in and stood near the window where he could see both the parking lot and the interior corridor. The rest of the men waited outside. For the next hour and 40 minutes, nobody said very much. Jack sat with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the corridor door, and he thought about the things Grace Walker had said before she lost consciousness. He thought about the mechanics of what Martinez had described, the cut seatbelt, the displaced driver's seat, the absence of personal items on the driver's side. He thought about the wedding dress. He thought about the ring. He thought about a man who drives his pregnant wife off a mountain on their anniversary. He thought about what kind of man does that. And he thought about what kind of man that man would become when he walked into this hospital and found 22 Hell's Angels in the waiting room and his wife still breathing. He didn't have to wait long to find out. At 6:17 in the morning, a man walked through the emergency entrance. He was tall, easily 6'2", dressed in slacks and a white dress shirt, the shirt showing what might have been wrinkled from a long night or carefully distressed to suggest a long night, Jack couldn't tell which. Dark hair, well cut, the kind of face that appeared in local newspapers and at charity events. Handsome in the specific way that money and confidence produce the way that sometimes photographs better than it looks in person. He spoke to the desk nurse, immediately urgent, in low hands on the counter, leaning forward, all the body language of a distraught husband, perfectly calibrated. Jack watched him. He watched the way the man's eyes moved while he talked to the nurse. Not down, not inward, not the unfocused drift of someone in genuine shock. They moved laterally, scanning, taking inventory, looking for something specific. The nurse said something. The man straightened. He turned to look at the waiting room, and his eyes landed on Jack. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the man smiled. It was a brief smile, controlled and thin there, and gone in under a second, and if Jack had blinked, he'd have missed it. But he didn't blink. He'd been watching too carefully to blink. It was not a relieved smile. It was not the smile of a man who had arrived at a hospital to find his wife alive and being treated. It was the smile of a man who had arrived at a hospital to find a problem he hadn't anticipated and who was already working on how to address it. Jack stood up. He walked across the waiting room to where the man was standing, and he stopped 4 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to be non-threatening, a distance he'd calibrated over years of difficult conversations. "Nathan Walker," Jack said. The man's expression reorganized itself into appropriate grief and surprise. "Yes, who are you?" "My name is Jack Sullivan. I pulled your wife out of that vehicle tonight." Something moved across Nathan Walker's face that he didn't quite manage to control. It was there for less time than the smile had been, a microsecond of raw, unguarded reaction that Jack cataloged immediately and stored. It was not gratitude. It was not relief. It was fury. "Thank you," Nathan said, and his voice was perfectly steady, perfectly warm. "I can't tell you what that means to me. They told you anything?" "They don't tell me much," Jack said. "I'm not family." "No," Nathan agreed pleasantly. "I suppose you're not." He started to move past Jack toward the desk. "She said something," Jack said. He said it quietly, conversationally, the way you'd mentioned that the weather was supposed to change. Nathan stopped. "Before she lost consciousness," Jack continued. "She was awake for a little while. Said a few things." A pause. "That's good," Nathan said. "That she was conscious. That's a good sign." "I thought so." Nathan turned to face him. The grief and distress were still there on his face, professionally maintained, but his eyes were doing something different now. And Jack let him look, let him assess, let him do the calculation he was clearly doing. "I appreciate everything you did tonight," Nathan said. "Truly, but this is a family matter now, and I'd like to see my wife." "Of course," Jack said. He stepped aside. Nathan walked past him and spoke to the nurse at the desk. Jack went back to his chair and sat down. Marcus, without looking at him, said quietly, "Well." Jack took a breath. He already knew she was alive, he said. When he came through that door, he already knew. Marcus was quiet for a moment. How? Because if he didn't know, his first question would have been whether she survived. That's what you ask when you don't know. Instead, he wanted to know where she was and what she'd said. Jack looked at the corridor door. He's not a grieving husband. He's a man doing damage control. Hector, from his position at the window, didn't say anything, but Jack saw him take out his phone. Good, Jack thought, because what was coming next was going to require everything they had. At 8:43 in the morning, a nurse came to the waiting room door. She was a small woman, maybe 50, with the permanently tired eyes of someone who had been doing emergency medicine for a long time. "Are you the men who brought in Grace Walker?" she asked. Jack stood. "We brought her to the ambulance." The nurse looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped closer and dropped her voice to a register that didn't carry. "She's out of surgery," she said. "The baby was delivered by emergency C-section at 7:06. The infant is premature but breathing on her own." She paused. "We're calling that a good outcome." Something inside Jack's chest unclenched. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding that particular knot until it released. "Mrs. Walker is stable," the nurse continued. "She's going to need more surgery on her left leg, possible spinal monitoring for the next 48 hours. Another pause, longer this time. "She's been asking for the man who pulled her out of the car." Jack blinked. "She's conscious, in and out, but coherent when she's awake." The nurse held his gaze steadily. "Her husband is with her now." The way she said it, not neutral, not informational. The tone of a person who is telling you something without being able to tell you the thing directly. Jack understood. "What's your name?" he asked. "Diane." "Diane," Jack said carefully, "is there anything you want to tell me that you're not telling me?" Diane looked at him for a long moment. "Mrs. Walker asked me before her husband came into the room whether the bikers were still in the waiting room." She kept her eyes on his. "I told her yes," she said. A brief hesitation. She said, "Don't let them leave." Jack nodded slowly. "We're not going anywhere," he said. Diane nodded once and went back through the door. Jack turned to Marcus and Hector. Neither of them had heard the conversation, but they read his face without difficulty. 20 plus years of riding together will do. That will make a man's face as readable as a hand signal in traffic. What do we need? Marcus asked. Jack sat back down. A lawyer, he said, and someone who knows how to pull evidence off a wrecked vehicle before it disappears. Hector was already on his phone. Outside in the parking lot, 20 men who had come to this mountain to bury a brother were now preparing without quite understanding it yet to fight a war. They were still wearing their funeral clothes. They didn't change. The lawyer Hector reached was a man named Roy Briggs, and Roy Briggs answered his phone at 9 in the morning, the way some people answer phones at 9 in the morning and after a long night, slowly, carefully, with the particular caution of someone who had learned that early calls rarely brought good news. I need you in Blackwood Falls, Hector said. Blackwood Falls, General. How fast can you get here? Hector, there's a woman who just survived someone driving her off a mountain. She's got a newborn in the NICU and a husband in her hospital room who put her there, and we need someone who can tell us what we're legally allowed to do about it before he figures out that we know. A silence. I'll be there in 90 minutes, Roy said. He made it in 74. Roy Briggs was 60 years old, compact and deliberate, with the kind of face that gave nothing away in a courtroom, and even less away in a hospital waiting room at 9 in the morning. He'd done legal work for the club for 11 years, not criminal defense. Mostly, though, he had done some of that too, but contract disputes, property issues, the kind of legal friction that accumulated when you ran a large organization that the world had already decided to be suspicious of. He was not a man who surprised easily. He looked at Jack when he came through the waiting room door, took in the scene. 22 bikers, funeral clothes still in the particular stillness of men who had been sitting in one place for too long and were holding themselves in check, and said, "Tell me everything." Jack told him everything. Roy listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Jack had always respected about him. He didn't ask clarifying questions mid-sentence. He didn't react visibly to the parts that warranted reaction. He just listened, and when Jack finished, he was quiet for exactly the length of time it took him to organize what he'd heard into something he could work with. The seatbelt, Roy said. Martinez saw it himself. Yes, in the driver's seat position. 6 feet minimum. Grace Walker is 5'4". Roy nodded slowly. The vehicle's in the ravine. What's left of it? Fire department will have been there by now. I don't know what state it's in. We need to find out. Roy pulled out his phone. I know a forensic accident analyst in Billings. She's done expert testimony in 3 states. If there's anything left worth documenting, she can document it in a way that holds up. He looked at Jack directly. You understand that if we start moving on, this Nathan Walker is going to know we're moving on it. And if he's got the kind of money and connections you're suggesting, that creates a problem. He's already a problem, Jack said. He's a manageable problem right now. The moment we make a move, he becomes a motivated problem. That's different. So we move fast. Roy held his gaze. We move smart. The two things were not always the same. Jack knew that. He had spent enough years making fast decisions and then living inside the consequences of those decisions to understand that speed and intelligence didn't always travel together. But he also knew that they were sitting in a hospital waiting room while the man who had tried to kill Grace Walker was alone with her in a room down the hall, and every minute that passed was a minute that man had to arrange the story he needed. How fast is smart? Jack asked. Give me 2 hours, Roy said. Damn. Marcus was the one who first noticed something was wrong in room 14. He'd been walking the corridor, not pacing, just walking the way a man walks when he needs to move, but has nowhere specific to go, and he passed the nurse's station near the end of the hall, and he noticed Diane, not because she was doing anything unusual, because she was doing nothing at all. She was standing very still at the station counter, watching the door of room 14, and her face had the particular tight quality of someone who wanted to go somewhere and had decided for reasons she was still working through not to. Marcus stopped beside her. How long has he been in there? He asked quietly. Diane didn't look at him. 40 minutes. Is she awake? She was when he went in. A pause. Is she still? Marcus asked. Diane finally looked at him. I haven't been able to check. Marcus looked at the door. Then he looked back at Diane. You have a reason to check vital signs, he said. Don't you? Diane picked up a chart from the counter. I check vital signs every 45 minutes on post-surgical patients. That's a good policy, Marcus said. She went down the hall. Marcus watched her knock on the door of room 14, enter, and close the door behind her. He counted. 60 seconds, 90, 2 minutes. She came back out at 2 minutes and 12 seconds. She walked back to the station and replaced the chart on the counter. Then she wrote something on a notepad, tore the page off, and held it out to Marcus without looking directly at him. He took it. He read it. He went back to the waiting room. Jack looked up when he entered and read his face before Marcus said a word. What? Marcus handed him the note. Jack read it. 4 words in Diane's handwriting, precise and deliberate. She's asking for you. Jack folded the note. He looked at Roy, who had been on his phone in the corner. Is there a legal reason I can't go to her room if she's asking for me? Jack said. Roy thought for 3 seconds. She's conscious, she's competent, she has the right to request visitors. The husband can't object, but he can't prohibit it. A pause. He might make it ugly. That's fine, Jack said. He knocked once and pushed the door open. Nathan Walker was sitting in the chair beside the bed. He was holding Grace's hand, or rather his hand was on top of hers, in a way that could photograph as tenderness, and felt from the doorway like something else entirely. He looked up when Jack entered with the specific expression of a man encountering something he had decided in advance to treat as an inconvenience. This is a private room, Nathan said. I know, Jack said. Your wife asked for me. Nathan's hand tightened slightly on Grace's. My wife is recovering from surgery, and she needs rest, not... Nathan. Grace's voice was quiet, but it cut the room like something sharp. Stop. Nathan stopped. Jack looked at Grace. She was pale in the way that people get when they've lost blood and had it partially restored, not white but thin, as though the color had been diluted. There was a bandage above her left eye. There were monitors attached to her arm and chest. Her left leg was elevated. She looked like someone who had been through something catastrophic. She also looked completely awake. Her eyes were on Jack with that same focused intensity he'd seen in the ravine, the look of a person who has decided very quickly and very specifically what they need from you. Is the baby okay? She said. The nurse said she's breathing on her own, Jack said. They're calling it a good outcome. Something in Grace's face broke open and then immediately closed again, the way a window opens to let in air and then shuts against the weather. She was not going to cry in front of Nathan Walker. That much was clear. Thank you, she said. You don't have to thank me. I know I don't have to. Her eyes stayed on his. I want to. Nathan stood up. He had several inches on Jack, and he used them straightening to his full height in the way that men do when they want a room to understand the geometry of the situation. I appreciate what you did last night, truly. But Grace needs to rest, and this isn't... Nathan. Grace's voice again, same register, same edge. I would like to speak to Mr. Sullivan alone. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Nathan looked at his wife, then he looked at Jack. His face was doing the professional grief thing again, but underneath it, in his eyes, the calculation was running hard and fast. He was doing math. He was figuring out what Grace might say, what she might have already said, what she might know about what Jack knew. He decided apparently that walking out was safer than staying. I'll give you a few minutes, he said with the tone of a man granting a favor, rather than complying with a request. He left. The door closed. For 3 seconds, neither Jack nor Grace said anything. Then Grace said, he cut my seatbelt. I know. Before we went over, he reached across while he was still driving, and he cut it with a utility knife he'd kept in the center console for 3 weeks. I watched him put it in there. I thought he was going to use it for the camping trip we kept talking about and never took. She stopped, started again. He told me to look at the view, the stars. He said the mountain looked beautiful at night, and when I turned to look, he reached across. Jack said nothing. He let her talk. I felt the belt go slack, and I knew, she said. Not immediately. For maybe 2 seconds, I told myself I was wrong, that it was an accident, that the buckle had failed, that it was anything other than what it was. And then I looked at his face and I knew. Her voice was steady, almost unnaturally steady. He wasn't scared. He wasn't surprised. He had his hands on the wheel and he was watching the road, and he was completely calm. The way you're calm when you've already decided something. Did you try to grab the wheel? I tried to grab him. A pause. He shoved me toward the door. Hard. I hit the window, and I remember the door coming open, and then I was falling, and then I wasn't falling anymore, and everything was very loud. And then it wasn't. Jack was quiet. He had a phone, Grace said. He threw it out the window before we went over. I saw him do it. He's got another one. He always has another one. She met Jack's eyes. He planned this. He's been planning it for months, since I changed the will. Tell me about the will. She told him. The $42 million family trust. Her parents both dead now. The inheritance that had always been intended for Grace and any children she had. Nathan's assumption from the beginning of the marriage that this money was part of what he was getting. The slow discovery over 3 years of what that assumption had cost her. The bruises she'd explained away. The trips she hadn't taken. The friends she'd stopped seeing because it was easier than managing his reaction to them. The day she'd sat in her lawyer's office and quietly, without telling Nathan, changed every document. He found out 6 weeks ago, she said. He didn't say anything. He just got very calm. Nathan gets a specific kind of calm when he's decided something. I've learned to be more afraid of the calm than the anger. Who's your lawyer? Jack said. Patricia Howe. She's in Missoula. Does she know what happened? She will when someone tells her. Grace looked at him steadily. Nathan is going to try to take my daughter. He's already talking to someone. I could hear him on the phone before you came in. He's going to say I'm unstable, that the crash affected my mental state, that I'm making things up. She stopped. He's done it before. 3 years ago when I tried to leave, he had a psychiatrist ready, someone who owed him something. I spent 4 days in an evaluation facility before my cousin got me out. A beat. He knows how to do this. Jack thought about Roy Briggs in the waiting room. How many people does he own in this county? He said. Grace didn't flinch at the directness. The sheriff went to school with Nathan's father. The judge who handles family cases in this district played golf with Nathan's uncle for 15 years. She paused. I don't know how deep it goes. I know it goes deep. Is there anyone who doesn't owe him? Grace thought for a moment. Patricia, my lawyer, she's one of the few people he never managed to get to. Another pause. And there's a woman, a journalist, retired. Her name is Carol Merritt. She spent 2 years trying to write a story about the Walker family, and then the paper she worked for got bought out and the story disappeared. She moved out of Blackwood Falls after that. I don't know where she is now, but she knows things. Grace held his gaze. Things that could help. Jack filed the name. I'm going to make some calls, he said. My lawyer is in the waiting room. He's good. He's going to help. Your lawyer, something that was almost a smile moved across her face. A Hells Angels lawyer. He's passed the bar in 3 states. Okay, she said. She took a breath. Okay. A pause. Mr. Sullivan. Jack. Jack. She said it like she was testing the weight of it. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You could have left me in that ravine with an ambulance on the way and been home by now. Jack was quiet for a moment. My wife left me 11 years ago, he said. She said I was never home, that the club was my real family, that she couldn't compete with it. She wasn't wrong exactly. I've thought about that a lot over the years. What I should have paid attention to and didn't. He looked at Grace. I don't know you, but I know what it looks like when someone's been alone inside a situation for a long time and finally runs out of options. I've seen that look before and walked past it. He stood up. I'm not walking past it again. Grace looked at him for a long moment. He's going to go after you, she said quietly. The moment he figures out you're not leaving, he's going to use everything he has. I expect so. You don't know what he has. No, Jack said, but he doesn't know what I have either. He went back out into the corridor. Nathan Walker was waiting 12 feet from the door, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his phone in his hand, the posture of a man who had been listening for the sound of the conversation without quite being able to make out the words. Jack walked past him without slowing down. Mr. Sullivan, Nathan said. Jack stopped, turned around. Nathan walked toward him until there were 6 feet between them. He dropped his voice to a register that didn't carry beyond the two of them. I want to be very clear about something, Nathan said. My wife is a very fragile woman. She's been through significant trauma tonight, and that trauma is going to affect what she remembers and how she remembers it. I've seen this happen before. Crash victims frequently construct narratives that don't align with the physical evidence. A pause. I don't know what she told you in there, but I want you to understand that anything she said in her current state is not reliable. Jack listened to this carefully. She seemed pretty sharp to me, he said. She seemed that way. Nathan's voice was patient, the voice of a man explaining something to someone he had already decided was not quite smart enough to understand it without help. But traumatic brain injury can produce exactly that impression. Lucidity without accuracy. It's documented. Interesting, Jack said. I think it would be best for Grace, for the baby, for everyone, if you and your... A precise pause. Associates left the hospital and let our family handle this privately. Jack nodded slowly as though he was considering this. I appreciate you explaining it to me, he said. I'll think on it. He turned and walked back toward the waiting room. Nathan watched him go. Roy was off his phone when Jack returned. The expression on his face said that the phone call had produced something. The accident analyst is on her way to the ravine right now, Roy said. She'll photograph everything before anyone moves the vehicle. I've also put a hold request in with the county on the vehicle itself, argued it as potential evidence in a personal injury claim. That'll give us 72 hours before anyone can legally dispose of it. Good. I also ran Nathan Walker. Roy paused. He's got money, old money and newer money combined. His father built the Walker Development and Empire starting in the 80s. Nathan took over 8 years ago and expanded, but he's got interests in commercial real estate, a regional bank, 2 construction companies, and a lobbying firm in Helena. Another pause. He's donated to the campaigns of 4 sitting county officials and 2 state legislators. The sheriff, Jack said, Gerald Hatch, went to school with Nathan's father, as you apparently already know. Been sheriff for 16 years. No serious challenges. 2 excessive force complaints dismissed without investigation. Roy looked at him steadily. This is a deeply planted tree, Jack. Then we dig down to the roots. That's poetic. What it means practically is that local law enforcement is not going to help us. Any complaint we file through the sheriff's office will land on Nathan Walker's desk before it lands anywhere useful. Roy tapped his phone against his palm. We need to go over the local level. Federal. FBI. If we can get physical evidence in front of a federal prosecutor, yes. But evidence needs to be solid, irrefutable, not something a bought judge can dismiss on a technicality. Jack looked at Hector. The photographs Martinez took at the ravine last night, where are they? On his phone and backed up to the cloud. Hector pulled out his own phone and showed Jack a folder. He sent them to me before you came down the embankment. I've got 37 images. Roy reached for the phone and looked at the photographs. He went through them slowly, methodically, his face doing its thing where nothing showed. This is a start, he said. It's not enough on its own, but it's a start. He handed the phone back. I want to talk to Grace Walker directly, as her counsel if she'll have me. She needs to know you're trustworthy, Jack said. Everyone does, Roy said. How do I convince her of that in the next 60 seconds? Tell her you know Patricia Howe. Roy blinked. I do know Patricia Howe. We went to law school together. Then lead with that. What happened next happened fast, the way things happen when multiple forces that have been building separately suddenly arrive at the same point. Roy went to Grace's room at 11:15 and came out 40 minutes later with a signed authorization making him her legal representative in any proceedings related to the accident, the custody of her daughter, and any civil or criminal matters arising from the events of the previous night. He'd gotten her signature on 3 separate documents, all witnessed by Diane, whose name would later appear in court filings as a party who had observed Mrs. Walker to be fully alert and competent at the time of signing. Nathan Walker did not know this had happened until it was done. At 12:30, Patricia Howe arrived from Missoula. She was 55, angular, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the specific briskness of a woman who had spent 30 years not wasting other people's time and expected the same consideration in return. She shook Roy's hand in the corridor outside the waiting room, said, Roy Briggs of all them, and then got down to business immediately. I've been trying to reach Grace for 3 months, Patricia said. Nathan had her phone monitored. I couldn't get a message through that he wasn't seeing first. She changed her will 6 weeks before the crash, Roy said. I know, I drafted the change. Patricia's voice was tight. I warned her. I told her that if Nathan found out before she had protection in place, she needed to leave immediately. She said she would handle it. She didn't have time to handle it. No. A pause for sure. Is she going to be all right? Physically, yes. The baby is in the NICU but stable. Roy glanced at Jack. The rest of it depends on what we do in the next few hours. Patricia looked at Jack the same way everyone looked at Jack when they encountered him for the first time in this context, reassessing. You're the one who pulled her out. Yes. And you're still here because she asked us not to leave, Jack said. Patricia absorbed this. All right, she said. Here's what Nathan is going to do. He's going to file for emergency custody of the infant on the grounds that Grace is medically incapacitated and mentally unstable. He's going to get Judge Caldwell to sign the order because Caldwell has been in Nathan's pocket for 8 years. Once he has that order, the baby is legally his and Grace becomes the obstacle rather than the victim. Everything she says after that point can be characterized as the delusion of an unstable woman trying to interfere with her husband's parental rights. She looked between Roy and Jack. He's done it before, smaller scale. He had a business partner committed to a psychiatric facility for 10 days back in 2019. The man dropped a lawsuit against Nathan the day he got out. Nothing was ever proven. The waiting room had gone very quiet. Jack became aware that the men around him, Marcus Hector Martinez, the others who had been moving in and out over the course of the morning, had stopped talking and were listening. How long do we have? Jack said. He'll file this afternoon if he hasn't already. Caldwell will sign it tonight. By morning, he'll have custody agents at the NICU. Patricia looked at him steadily. We have until morning. No. The afternoon moved in the specific way that days move when you are fighting a clock you cannot see. Roy and Patricia worked the legal angles from the waiting room phones and laptops, building the framework for a counterfiling that would challenge any custody order Nathan obtained on the grounds of Grace's competence and the suspicious circumstances of the crash. It was the right work to do. It was also, as Roy acknowledged privately to Jack, unlikely to be enough on its own. Legal filings in a corrupted local court were speed bumps, not walls. They needed something heavier. The accident analyst called from the ravine at 2:17. Her name was Sandra Reyes, and her voice was the voice of someone who had spent 20 years explaining mechanical facts to people who desperately wanted the facts to be different. Your instincts were correct, she told Roy, who had her on speaker in the corner of the waiting room. The passenger side seatbelt was severed with a blade instrument prior to the crash. The cut is clean and the angle is consistent with someone in the driver's seat reaching across. There are also tool marks on the brake line, not fully severed, but crimped in a way that would degrade performance under sustained pressure over a distance of approximately. The brake line, Roy interrupted, partially compromised, enough that by the time the vehicle was traveling at speed on a mountain grade, the driver would have had significantly reduced stopping ability, consistent with a vehicle that was intended to go over the edge. A pause. I've also pulled the event data recorder, the vehicle's onboard computer logs, steering input, acceleration, braking, and speed for the 30 seconds prior to impact. Roy was very still. What does it show? In the 15 seconds before the vehicle left the road, there was no braking input. Zero. At a point on the highway where the guardrail is the only thing between the road and a 60-foot drop. Another pause. There was, however, a sudden, sharp steering input toward the outside of the curve at 7 seconds before impact. Full lock. Maintained for 4 seconds. Jack understood what that meant before Roy said it. Someone had deliberately turned the wheel into the ravine. I'm sending photographs of everything to your secure server, Sandra said. Everything I've documented. Chain of custody is clean. Thank you, Sandra, Roy said. He ended the call. The waiting room was silent. Then Hector said quietly, he planned to drive it off the mountain. And then jump clear before impact, Marcus said. That's why the driver's seat was all the way back. He needed room to move. Jack thought about the open door, the door that had been opened before the crash, not blown open by it. He thought about a man calculating the exact geometry of a fall, at what speed, at what angle, from what position a person could exit a moving vehicle and survive while the vehicle continued without them. He thought about the 3 weeks the utility knife had been in the center console. He thought about a man telling his pregnant wife to look at the stars. "We need a federal contact," Jack said. "Right now, today." Patricia looked up from her laptop. "I have someone, an assistant U.S. attorney in Helena. She's been building a case against the Walker family's lobbying operation for 2 years. She's been looking for a crack." Patricia held his gaze. "This is the crack." "Call her," Jack said. Patricia was already dialing. At 4:50 in the afternoon, Nathan Walker came to the waiting room. He didn't come alone. He had a man with him, early 40s, suit the specific blank professional face of a lawyer who billed by the 6-minute increment. They stopped at the waiting room entrance, and Nathan looked across the room at Jack with an expression that had finally dropped the pretense of grief. "I've been advised," Nathan said, "that you've retained legal representation for my wife without her capacity to consent." Roy stood up. "Mr. Walker, I'm Roy Briggs. Mrs. Walker executed the representation agreement this morning. She was fully competent at the time of signing, witnessed by nursing staff." He reached into his jacket and produced a copy. "You're welcome to the documentation." Nathan didn't take it. He looked at it the way people look at things they've decided to treat as irrelevant. "My wife is a trauma patient," he said. "She's not capable of making legal decisions. That determination would require a court order finding her incompetent," Roy said pleasantly. "Do you have one?" A pause. "I will by morning," Nathan said. "We look forward to reviewing it." Roy didn't sit down. "Is there something specific you needed, Mr. Walker? Because this is a hospital waiting room, and these men are guests of Mrs. Walker, who has specifically requested their presence." Nathan's eyes went from Roy to Jack. "You have no idea what you're involved in," he said. His voice was still even, still controlled, but the patience in it had thinned to something that was almost honest. "Probably not the full picture," Jack agreed, "but we've got a good start." Nathan looked at him for a long moment. "This isn't how this ends," he said. "No," Jack said. "It's not." Nathan turned and left. His lawyer followed without having said a single word. The waiting room breathed again. "He's going to move tonight," Patricia said from her laptop. "He's not going to wait until morning. He's filing right now." "Is your federal contact reachable tonight?" Jack said. "She said she'd have someone from the field office here by 9. Jack looked at the clock on the wall. 4 hours and 12 minutes. "Marcus," he said. "Already on it," Marcus said, and stepped into the corridor with his phone. Jack sat down. He thought about a tiny girl in the NICU 3 floors above him, breathing on her own in a world she had arrived into 6 weeks early and completely without warning, in a burning wreck on the side of a mountain, pulled free by a biker in a funeral jacket who had just buried someone else. He thought about Grace Walker, choosing the name Faith. He didn't know that yet. That would come later. But he thought about her anyway, that small, fierce creature who had survived something designed to kill her before she ever drew breath. And he felt something he hadn't expected to feel in a hospital waiting room in a town he'd never been to before last night. He felt like he wasn't going anywhere. Not for anything. Patricia's federal contact called back at 5:43. Her name was Agent Lena Marsh, Assistant U.S. Attorney, assigned to the Helena field office, and she did not waste time on pleasantries. Patricia had her on speaker laptop open, Roy sitting beside her with a legal pad covered in notes, and she spoke with the precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of call for longer than she wanted to admit. "I've been building a RICO predicate against Walker Development for 22 months, Marsh said. "Bribery, wire fraud, obstruction. We've had the financial architecture mapped for 8 months. What we've been missing is a human victim. Someone whose story connects the financial crimes to physical harm." A pause that had weight in it. "Is Mrs. Walker willing to cooperate?" "She's been cooperating since 6 this morning," Patricia said. "She signed representation papers, gave a full statement to her attorneys, and has been asking how to help since she came out of surgery." "Physical evidence," Roy spoke up. "Event data recorder showing deliberate steering input into the ravine. Severed seatbelt blade instrument angle, consistent with a driver reaching across. Partially compromised brake line. Photographs of all of it taken within 90 minutes of the crash, chain of custody documented. Expert analyst on site now completing her formal report." Silence on the line. Then Marsh said, "Where's this evidence right now?" "Photographs on a secure server. Physical evidence at the crash site. We have a 72-hour hold on vehicle disposal through a civil filing. The analyst is still on site. I need copies of everything transmitted to me within the hour. Encrypted. Patricia, you have my secure address. A beat. I'm also going to need someone to formally obstruct whatever Judge Caldwell signs tonight, because he will sign something tonight. Nathan Walker doesn't wait. We have a counter-filing ready, Roy said. Your counter-filing is going to get laughed out of Caldwell's courtroom, Marsh said not unkindly. What it will do is create a record, a federal record once I attach to it. That record is what matters. It establishes a pattern. Another pause. How many men do you have in that hospital? Roy looked at Jack, who had been standing near the window listening. 22, Roy said. Keep them there, Marsh said, legally peacefully in the waiting room. Don't give local law enforcement any reason to remove them. I need them visible, and I need them documented as being there without incident. Understood, Jack said loud enough to be heard on the call. Marsh heard him. Is that Sullivan? Yes, Jack said. I know who you are, Marsh said. I know your club. I'm not going to pretend I don't have a file. A pause. What you did this morning, keeping those men in that waiting room without incident, without interference, without giving local law a single thing to work with, that was smart. Keep doing that. That's the plan, Jack said. Good. Because the moment Sheriff Hatch has a legitimate reason to remove you from that building, Nathan Walker walks into that NICU unchallenged. A brief pause. Don't give him that reason. The call ended. Patricia looked at Roy. Roy looked at Jack. Hector, from his position near the door, let out a slow breath. She's been waiting for this, Marcus said. 2 years, Roy said. She said 22 months. Which means the Walker family has been doing this long enough to build a federal case, Jack said. Grace wasn't the first. No, Patricia said quietly. She wasn't. The name Carol Merritt came back to Jack at 6:15 when Martinez came in from the parking lot with his phone and a look on his face that meant he'd found something. You said the journalist, Martinez said. The one who tried to write the story about the Walkers. Grace mentioned her. Retired. Moved out of Blackwood Falls. She didn't move far. Martinez held up his phone. She's in Garrison, 40 miles east. She's been blogging since the paper shut her down, not about the Walkers specifically, but about corruption in rural Montana counties. She's got a following, not huge, but serious people. Lawyers, journalists, a state legislator follows her. He paused. And she posted something this morning. He showed Jack the screen. The blog post was timestamped 7:44 a.m. The title was 3 words, Blackwood Falls, again. The body of the post was careful, no names, no specifics, nothing that could be called defamatory, but it connected a series of dots that only someone who had spent 2 years investigating the Walker family would know to connect. A prominent local family, a mountain road, a woman in critical condition. Questions about the official narrative. She'd been watching, she'd known within hours. Call her, Jack said. Already tried, she didn't pick up. Then drive to Garrison, Jack said. Right now, take Hector with you. Martinez didn't hesitate. He was out the door in 30 seconds, Hector behind him. Jack turned back to the room. What happened in the next 90 minutes was the specific kind of organized chaos that Jack had learned over decades to move through rather than against. Patricia was on the phone with Marsh's office transmitting encrypted files. Roy was drafting the counter-filing with a speed that suggested he'd been building toward this document all day without quite knowing it. Marcus had taken a position in the corridor near the nurse's station that was technically permissible and strategically excellent, visible enough to deter, present enough to observe. And Jack sat with Grace for 20 minutes at 6:30 because she'd asked and because there were things she needed to tell him that didn't belong in a legal document. She told him about the first time Nathan hit her. It was 8 months into the marriage, a dinner party. She'd said something at the table that embarrassed him. Not anything cruel, not anything designed to wound, just a small correction of a story he was telling that turned out to be inaccurate. He'd laughed it off at the table. He'd been perfectly charming for the rest of the evening. And when they got home in the kitchen, reaching past her for a glass, he'd grabbed her arm and twisted it hard enough to leave a mark that lasted 10 days. He hadn't apologized. He had explained. He'd told her very calmly, in that specific calm that she'd already learned to read correctly, that she needed to understand how things worked between them. That what was his, and what was hers was also his, and that included her words in public. That he had spent a long time building the life they lived, and he expected it to be protected. She told herself it was a one-time thing. It wasn't a one-time thing. Why didn't you leave earlier? Jack asked, and he asked it without judgment because he'd learned from years of watching people in impossible situations that the question wasn't why they stayed. The question was what had been built around them to make leaving feel unsurvivable. Because the first time I tried, he had me committed, Grace said. And the second time I tried, he destroyed my cousin financially. Her business, her credit, her reputation. He did it in 6 weeks and never left a fingerprint on any of it. She looked at Jack steadily. He told me afterward that he hadn't done anything, that it was just bad luck, that I should be careful about the stories I told myself. A pause. He was so calm when he said it. And the will change, Jack said. That was your third try. That was my real try, she said. I knew if I went at him directly again, I wouldn't get another chance. So I went around him, changed everything legally, protected the baby, made sure that even if something happened to me, he couldn't touch what belonged to her. Her voice didn't waver. I just didn't move fast enough afterward. You moved fast enough, Jack said. You're still here. Something in her face shifted. Not the window opening again, not the emotion she was working hard to contain. Something quieter. The look of a person receiving something they hadn't expected and weren't quite sure how to hold. He's going to say, the baby isn't his, Grace said suddenly. That's going to be the next thing. He'll use it to complicate the custody filing, to muddy everything to make it about my character instead of his. He'll find someone willing to testify that I was... She stopped. He can request a paternity test, Jack said. So can you. I know, but it takes time, and in the time it takes, he'll have her. Jack thought about the NICU, about the small girl 3 floors up, about the nurses who were currently the only thing standing between that child and a man who had tried to kill them both before she was born. We're not going to let that happen, he said. You don't know. I know we have 4 hours before his court order goes through, Jack said. I know we have a federal attorney who's been building a case against him for 2 years. I know we have physical evidence that proves he drove that vehicle off that mountain deliberately. He held her gaze. And I know 21 men in that waiting room who have been awake for 20 hours and are not going anywhere. Grace was quiet for a long moment. There's something else, she said. Something I didn't tell Roy because I wasn't sure it mattered. Tell me. Nathan has a storage unit, she said. Outside of town, Route 9 near the old grain elevator. He's been going there for 2 years. He told me it was for business documents. Early in the marriage, I believed him. Later, she paused. Later, I knew that everything he called a business document was something he needed to keep somewhere I couldn't access it. She looked at Jack. Whatever he has in there, he doesn't want found. Jack stood up. I'll be back, he said. He found Roy in the corridor and told him about the storage unit in 12 words. Roy said, we can't touch it without a warrant. I know. But Marsh can get an emergency warrant if she has probable cause, which the evidence we've already sent her might provide. Might, Roy said. Or she can argue that a man under federal investigation maintaining a private storage facility he hid from his wife in combination with evidence of premeditated attempted murder is enough probable cause to... He stopped. I'll call her. Jack went back to the waiting room. At 7:40, Martinez called from Garrison. Carol Merritt had let them in. She was 71 years old, Martinez said. She had a house full of filing cabinets and a voice like someone who had been disappointed by powerful people for 50 years and had made a kind of peace with it. She'd offered them coffee, asked 2 questions about Grace's condition, and then walked them to the back room. She's got files, Martinez said. He was whispering, which told Jack that Carol Merritt was within earshot and that he didn't want her to know he was calling. Jack, she's got years of files. Walker family, going back to the father, maybe further. There are incident reports in here, police reports that were filed and then disappeared from official records, insurance claims, death certificates. A pause, and in the pause, Jack heard the sound of paper moving. There are 3 death certificates in here, Jack. 3 people connected to Walker Development who died in accidents over the past 15 years. 2 car accidents and a boating incident. Jack sat down. He felt something cold and clear move through him. Not surprised he'd been expecting something like this since 6 in the morning, since the moment he'd looked into Nathan Walker's eyes in the waiting room and seen the calculation running. But confirmation was different from expectation. Confirmation had weight. Is she willing to talk to federal authorities, Jack said. Martinez relayed the question. A pause. Then in the background, unmistakably, a woman's voice dry and certain. Tell him I've been waiting 2.5 years for someone to ask. At 8:20, the lobby doors opened and Sheriff Gerald Hatch walked in. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with a lawman's deliberate walk and the particular expression of someone doing a job they have been asked to do by someone they owe a favor. He had 2 deputies behind him. He stopped at the waiting room entrance and looked at the men inside with the practiced assessment of law enforcement counting, cataloging, deciding. Jack stood up. Evening, Sheriff, he said. Hatch looked at him with the wariness of a man who had expected to come into a situation and found it more organized than anticipated. You, Sullivan. I am. I'm going to need you and your people to vacate the premises. Hospital administration has asked that non-family members. Has hospital administration asked that? Roy was on his feet, moving to stand beside Jack with his briefcase in hand. Because I spoke with the hospital administrator, Dr. Patel, at 4:30 this afternoon, and he confirmed that Mrs. Walker had specifically requested the presence of these individuals, and that request was being honored. Hatch blinked. It was a small blink, the blink of a man whose script has just been revised without his knowledge. I've got a request from the family. From Nathan Walker, Roy said, who is not currently Mrs. Walker's legal representative or medical decision-maker. That authority rests with Mrs. Walker herself, who is competent, and her legal counsel, which is me. He produced a document. This is the competency attestation signed by Dr. Eleanor Park. Mrs. Walker's attending physician at 7:15 this evening. Would you like a copy? Hatch didn't take the document. He looked at Jack. There are 22 of you, he said. 20, Jack said. 2 of our members are currently in garrison assisting federal investigators. The word federal did something to Hatch's face. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a recalibration happening behind them. Jack watched it happen and kept his own expression neutral. What federal investigators? Hatch said carefully. I refer you to Assistant U.S. Attorney Lena Marsh at the Helena Field Office, Roy said. She's been in contact with our office since this afternoon. I'd be happy to provide her direct number. Another pause. Hatch was doing math, you could see it. He was calculating what he'd been told to do against what he was seeing, which was a roomful of large men with legal representation and a federal attorney's name on their lips, and a sheriff who had spent 16 years being the biggest power in the room was suddenly realizing he was not in the biggest power in the room. I want these people in the waiting room only, Hatch said finally. Anyone moves toward patient areas without authorization, I pull them out. Agreed, Roy said immediately. Hatch looked at Jack for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the entrance. His deputies followed. At the door, he stopped without turning around. Sullivan, he said. Yeah. Watch yourself. He left. The room exhaled. He's going to call Nathan, Marcus said. Of course he is, Jack said. Let him. All right. The call that changed everything came at 9:17. It came to Roy's phone from Marsh. And Roy took it in the corner with his back to the room, which told Jack immediately that something significant had happened. He watched Roy's shoulders, the way they settled differently about 90 seconds into the call. The way his free hand, which had been moving while he talked, went still. Roy ended the call and turned around. He looked at Jack. The storage unit, he said. Tell me. Marsh got the warrant. Field agents executed it 40 minutes ago. Roy was choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that what he was about to say would land hard. There are financial records going back 9 years. Evidence of wire fraud, money laundering through the Walker development accounts. Correspondence emails printed and stored with the sheriff's office, with Caldwell's chambers, with 2 county prosecutors. A pause, and there are files on Grace. The room had gone completely quiet. What kind of files? Jack said. Medical files, psychiatric evaluations, the ones from 2021 when he had her committed, but also notes, handwritten notes that appear to be from a licensed psychiatrist, notes describing Grace as delusional paranoid, prone to fabricating abuse, dated, signed. Roy paused again. The psychiatrist is licensed in Montana. His name is Dr. William Carver. He has no record of ever treating Grace Walker. The notes appear to have been fabricated. He built the case in advance, Jack said. Years in advance, Roy said. He was preparing to have her permanently committed. The custody order for the baby, the psychiatric hold, the fabricated medical history, it was all staged. He was going to use the crash as the trigger. Roy met Jack's eyes. If she died in that ravine, it would have been a tragedy. If she'd survived brain damaged or traumatized, he would have used the fabricated psychiatric history to have her committed within the week. Either way, he got the baby, he got the estate, and Grace disappeared. The silence in the room was the kind that comes after something lands, that changes the shape of everything. Martinez, who had come back from Garrison an hour earlier with Carol Merritt's files in a box in the back of his truck, said quietly, he didn't just plan to drive her off that mountain. No, Jack said. He planned everything that came after. Yes. Jack thought about Grace in that hospital room, pressing her hands against her abdomen, even while unconscious. He thought about 3 weeks with a utility knife in the center console. He thought about a man telling his wife to look at the stars. He thought about how long Nathan Walker had been looking at his wife the way a problem to be solved. Marsh is moving tonight, Roy said. She's coordinating with the FBI field office. There will be agents at the hospital within the hour. What about Caldwell's order, Jack said. Marsh is filing an emergency federal injunction to stay it. If Caldwell signs the custody order, the injunction automatically supersedes it in federal jurisdiction. Roy allowed himself a small, tight satisfaction. Nathan Walker is going to walk into Caldwell's chambers tonight with his lawyer and find a federal hold waiting for him. And Caldwell, Marcus said. Caldwell is about to have a very uncomfortable conversation with people who have been reading his financial records for the past 3 hours. Roy paused. He's not Nathan Walker's problem anymore. He's his own problem. Shut up. At 10:04, Jack's phone buzzed. He looked at it. The text was from a number he didn't recognize. 6 words. They're moving the baby. Right now. He was out of the waiting room and into the corridor before he'd consciously decided to move. Marcus was 1 step behind him. The elevator was too slow. They took the stairs. 3rd floor. The NICU was through a set of double doors with a keypad lock and a window beside them. Jack pressed his face to the window. Inside, 2 nurses and a man in a suit were standing near one of the incubators. Not a doctor. Not scrubs. A suit. And beside him, a woman with a clipboard and the particular blank authority of someone executing a legal order. Jack hit the intercom button beside the door. A nurse came to the window. He held up Roy's business card against the glass, not the right tool for the moment, but the fastest communication he had. I need Dr. Patel, he said into the intercom. Right now. Tell him Roy Briggs sent me and tell him there's a federal injunction on this child, and whoever is in there with a clipboard needs to stop what they're doing immediately. The nurse looked at the card, looked at Jack, looked back into the NICU. She went to the desk and picked up a phone. 40 seconds that felt like 40 minutes. Then the double doors opened. Dr. Patel was a small man with the exhausted precision of someone who had been awake for 18 hours and was accustomed to that state. He looked at Jack, at Marcus, at the card in Jack's hand. What exactly is happening? Patel said. The woman in there with the clipboard is attempting to execute a county custody order that has been federally stayed, Jack said. If she removes that child from this facility, she is interfering with a federal proceeding. So is anyone who assists her. Patel's eyes narrowed. Can you prove the stay exists? Jack called Roy. Roy answered on the first ring and was talking to Patel in 45 seconds, giving him the case number, the federal docket reference, Marsh's direct line. The kind of specific authoritative information that either convinced you or it didn't. It convinced Patel. He went back through the double doors. Jack and Marcus stood in the corridor and waited. 90 seconds later, the woman with the clipboard came out of the NICU. She walked past Jack and Marcus without making eye contact and disappeared toward the elevator. The man in the suit came out behind her. He looked at Jack with the expression of someone who was recalculating very quickly. Who sent you? Jack said. The man didn't answer. Was it Nathan directly or through his lawyer? Jack said. Still nothing. It doesn't matter, Jack said. Either way, you're going to want to call your client and tell him it didn't work. The man left. Jack stood in the corridor for a moment. He became aware that his hands were shaking slightly, which surprised him. He hadn't noticed during the run up the stairs, hadn't noticed during the conversation at the NICU door, hadn't noticed through any of it. The shaking was the body catching up to what the mind had already processed and moved past. He pressed his back against the wall and took a breath. Marcus stood beside him. "You good?" Marcus said. "Yeah. Your hands are shaking." "I know." Marcus didn't say anything else. He just stood there, which was, Jack reflected, one of the things he had always valued most about Marcus Webb. The man understood that sometimes the most useful thing you could do for someone was simply stand beside them and not comment on it. At 10:49, Nathan Walker arrived at the hospital for the second time that day. He came through the emergency entrance fast, his lawyer behind him, and he went directly toward the elevator bank without looking at the waiting room. He'd been told the custody order had been blocked. He was not a man who accepted blocked. Jack was waiting in the lobby. He stepped into Nathan's path. Not aggressively, not physically. He simply stood in the space between Nathan and the elevator, and Nathan had to stop or walk through him, and Nathan chose to stop. "It's over," Jack said. Nathan looked at him with an expression that had finally abandoned all performance. No grief, no charm, no professional calm, just something raw and cold and direct. "You have no idea what you've done," Nathan said. "I pulled a woman out of a burning vehicle," Jack said. "Everything that followed was your doing. You interfered in something that was none of your business, and you have destroyed. You drove your pregnant wife off a mountain," Jack said. "You cut her seatbelt. You tampered with the brake line. You built a fake psychiatric file to have her committed. You paid a judge and a sheriff, and you had people follow her, and you controlled every exit for years." His voice was completely even. "And then you told her to look at the stars." Nathan's jaw tightened. "You couldn't even let her look at whatever she wanted on the last night of her life," Jack said. "You had to direct that too." Something moved across Nathan's face that Jack had not seen there before. Not the fury from the morning, not the calculation from the afternoon. Something smaller and uglier and more honest than either of those. It was fear. "Federal agents are going to be here within the hour," Jack said. "Your storage unit has been opened. Your files are being read. Your judge is being interviewed." He paused. "The only decision you have left is what you do in the next 60 minutes. Nathan looked at him for a long, unreadable moment. Then he said very quietly, "I want to see my daughter." Jack said nothing for 3 seconds. "That's not your call anymore," he said. Nathan's lawyer touched his arm, said something low. Nathan stood very still. Then he turned and walked back toward the entrance. Jack watched him go. He watched the doors slide open, and Nathan Walker walk out into the Montana night, and he watched those doors close behind him, and he stayed exactly where he was until he was certain Nathan wasn't coming back. Then he went and sat down. At 11:17, 3 FBI vehicles pulled into the hospital parking lot. At 11:49, Roy came to find Jack in the waiting room. "Marsh has enough," Roy said. "She's issuing arrest warrants tonight." Nathan Caldwell, 2 of Hatch's deputies. Hatch himself is being interviewed right now at the field office in Helena. He paused. "Carol Merritt's files combined with the storage unit material, it's what she needed. She said it's the cleanest package she's seen in 20 years of federal prosecution." Jack nodded. "Grace needs to know," he said. "I told her attorney. Patricia is with her now." "Is she okay?" Roy was quiet for a moment. "She asked if the baby was still in the building." "She is." "Then Grace said she's okay." Roy looked at him steadily. "She also said to tell you something." "What?" "She said tell Jack the stars were beautiful." A pause. "I don't know what that means." Jack did. He sat with it for a moment. With the weight of it, the dark humor of it, the defiance packed into 4 words from a woman in a hospital bed who had survived something designed to kill her and was already in the way of people with deep reserves of something the world doesn't have a clean word for, finding the edge of herself again. He almost smiled. He didn't. Not quite. But it was close. Outside in the parking lot, the FBI vehicles sat with their lights on, and 20 bikers who had come to a mountain to bury their brother were still there, still present, still exactly where they'd said they'd be. And the night that had started on a highway with smoke rising from a ravine was finally beginning to turn. Nathan Walker drove east on Highway 12 for 6 miles before the blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. He pulled over. He sat with his hands on the wheel. He was very calm. It was the specific calm of a man who had finally run out of road. They arrested Nathan Walker at 11:53 on Highway 12, 6 miles east of Blackwood Falls, in the same direction he had driven his pregnant wife the night before. The FBI agent who made the arrest later told Marsh that Walker had been completely cooperative. Hands on the wheel, no resistance, no argument. He'd handed over his license and registration like a man who had already decided what posture to adopt and had chosen the one that preserved the most options. He didn't ask what the charges were. He didn't ask for his lawyer immediately, which was itself notable, a man who had spent years using lawyers the way other men used weapons, suddenly sitting quietly with his hands in his lap. The agent told Marsh he'd seen that before. That specific stillness. It was the stillness of a man whose mind was already somewhere else, entirely already working the next problem, already 3 moves ahead, on a board that had just been completely reset. What Nathan Walker had not anticipated, and what that stillness could not account for, was that there was no next move. The storage unit had been the thing. Marsh explained it to Roy at midnight in the hospital parking lot, standing beside one of the FBI vehicles, her breath visible in the cold Montana air. Roy listened and then came inside and told Jack, and Jack sat with it the way he sat with most things, quietly letting it settle to its proper depth before deciding what to do with it. The storage unit had contained 9 years of Nathan Walker's actual bookkeeping, not the sanitized version that went to accountants and auditors. The real version. The version that showed every dollar paid to Judge Caldwell over 8 years, cash transactions structured carefully below federal reporting thresholds, laundered through a shell company Nathan had established in Delaware in 2016. The version that showed payments to 2 county prosecutors, to 4 of Hatch's deputies, and to Sheriff Hatch himself, not in cash, but in construction contracts awarded to a company that Hatch's brother-in-law owned, which was cleaner but not clean enough when federal forensic accountants got hold of it. There were emails, printed, which was an old-fashioned habit that turned out to be catastrophically incriminating. Digital records could be disputed, claimed to be doctored, subjected to authenticity challenges. Paper with Nathan Walker's own handwriting in the margins was harder to argue with. There were margin notes on the correspondence with Caldwell that used language no innocent man uses when writing to a judge. There were notes on correspondence with Dr. William Carver, the psychiatrist who had produced the fabricated evaluations of Grace that outlined exactly what Carver was expected to say and when. And there were the other files, the ones Martinez had sensed before he knew what they were. 3 manila folders, each labeled with a name and a date. 3 people connected to Walker Development who had died in accidents over 15 years. The boating incident, the 2 car crashes. Each folder contained what appeared to be planning documents. Logistical notes. In one case, a hand-drawn diagram of a boat's fuel system with certain components circled in red ink. Marsh had said on the phone to Roy earlier that she was treating those 3 folders as the highest priority items in the investigation. That federal homicide charges were a separate, insignificant matter from the fraud and corruption case she'd been building. That the scope of what Nathan Walker had done was considerably larger than attempted murder on a mountain road. How many people knew? Roy had asked. Enough, Marsh had said. Enough that we're going to be working this case for a long time. Jack sat with that too. He thought about Grace upstairs in her room and the years she had lived inside a man's carefully constructed world without knowing the full dimensions of what she was living inside. He thought about what it meant to be the most recent target of someone who had been practicing for 15 years. He thought about how close it had come. He thought about 60 feet of ravine in a white dress and hands pressed against an abdomen, even in unconsciousness. He stood up and went to find Diane. Diane was at the nurse's station at 12:20, and she looked up when Jack came around the corner with the particular wariness she'd shown all day, the wariness of a person who had been making small, significant decisions throughout a long shift and wasn't sure what the next one was going to cost her. How is she? Jack said. Resting? Diane glanced down the hall. Better than she should be, honestly. She's strong. A pause. Her daughter is doing well. They let her hold her for 20 minutes tonight. Jack stopped. Something about that sentence, the plainness of it, the 20 minutes, the specificity, hit him somewhere he hadn't expected. Good, he said. She named her, Diane said. What? The baby. She named her tonight when she held her. Diane looked at Jack with an expression that was professional and careful, and underneath both of those things genuinely moved. She named her Faith. Jack was quiet. She said she named her that because Strangers gave her something she thought no longer existed. Diane paused. I thought you should know. Jack nodded once. He went back to the waiting room. He sat down. He did not explain to the men around him why his face looked the way it looked, and none of them asked because 22 men who have ridden together through every season of life understand that some things don't require explanation. Marcus handed him a cup of coffee from the vending machine without saying anything. Jack took it. He held it with both hands. He thought about Danny Cortez, who they'd buried yesterday, who had been 41 years old and gone in 6 weeks, who had never once made you feel like you owed him anything, even when you owed him everything. He thought about the funeral ride and the formation on the highway and the cold Montana dark and the sound of squealing tires ahead. He thought about how the night had been supposed to go. He thought about Faith. The arrest came in waves the way federal arrests always do, coordinated, timed, each one designed so that no one could warn anyone else before the agents were already at the door. Judge Leonard Caldwell was arrested at 1:15 in the morning at his home, still in his bathrobe. He didn't resist. He asked for his lawyer and then in the car, on the way to the field office, said something to the agent beside him that the agent later included in his report. He said, I always knew this was going to happen. The agent asked what he meant. Caldwell said, men like Nathan Walker, they borrow you until they're done with you, and then they leave the bill. He didn't say anything else after that. Sheriff Gerald Hatch was arrested at 1:40 at his office, where he'd apparently been since the FBI vehicles arrived at the hospital. He'd been sitting at his desk, and the agents who came in found him with a cup of coffee and a look on his face that suggested he'd spent the previous 2 hours making peace with something. He went without a word. Not cooperative in the way Nathan had been cooperative, not calculating, not tactical, just resigned. The resignation of a man who had known somewhere deep and unexamined that the favor he'd owed Robert Walker since 1987 was always going to cost more than it was worth. Deputy Leon Marsh, no relation to the federal attorney, was arrested at 2 in the morning at his home. He did not go quietly, he argued. He demanded to see the warrant. He made phone calls that went unanswered. He was the only one who seemed genuinely surprised, which told the arresting agents something about how much Hatch had been shielding his own people from the full picture. Dr. William Carver was arrested at 2:30 at a hotel in Missoula, where he'd apparently driven the previous evening. The fact that he'd left town before the story broke publicly told Marsh something about Nathan Walker's network, that there had been a communication system, a warning system that she hadn't fully mapped yet, that some of the dominoes had gotten a signal before the rest fell. It didn't help Carver or Nathan or any of them. Roy called Jack at 2:47 with the arrest count. Nathan, Caldwell, Hatch, 3 deputies, Carver, and 2 city officials from the Planning Commission who appear to have been facilitating the Walker development land acquisitions. Roy's voice was tired and precise. Marsh says there are more coming. She's treating this as an ongoing investigation. This is the first wave, not the last. What about Nathan specifically, Jack said. Attempted murder, conspiracy, domestic violence. There are enough documented incidents in Grace's medical records, once you read them correctly, to build that charge independently of her testimony. Tampering with a vehicle, insurance fraud. He had a large life insurance policy on Grace. A pause. And the 3 historical deaths. Those investigations are being reopened. She's not filing charges on those yet, but she's building toward it. How much time is he looking at? Multiple life sentences if she gets everything she's going for, Roy said. And she strikes me as someone who generally gets what she goes for. Yeah, Jack said. She does. At 3 in the morning, Grace Walker asked for Jack again. Diane came to the waiting room door at 3:04 and looked at him the way she'd looked at him all day, with the eyes of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, but was still capable of being moved by specific things. And she said, she's awake. She wants to talk to you. Jack went up. Grace was sitting up in the bed when he came in, which was a significant change from that morning. Not sitting up fully, not without the assistance of the raised mattress, but upright. Present. Her eyes were clear, and there was color in her face that hadn't been there at 6 in the morning, or even at 6:30 that evening. She looked, Jack thought, like someone who had made a decision. They told me, she said before he'd reached the chair. Roy called Patricia, she told me. What specifically? All of it. The storage unit, the files, the other people. She paused. The 3 people. Jack sat down. Yeah, he killed them, she said. It was not a question. Marsh thinks so. She's investigating. Grace was quiet for a moment, not processing she'd already processed. She had the stillness of someone who has traveled a long way to reach a conclusion and has arrived. I used to think, she said, that I was the problem, that if I had been different, smarter, easier, more careful about what I said in public, none of it would have happened, that I had somehow created the situation. She looked at Jack. Therapists call that internalized blame. I know that now. At the time, I just thought it was logic. It wasn't logic, Jack said. No, a pause. But knowing that and feeling that are two different things. I've known it was wrong for 2 years. I'm still working on feeling it. She looked at her hands, which were folded on the blanket in front of her. When they told me about the 3 people, about the files, about how long he'd been doing this before he ever met me. She stopped. I'm not the reason he became that. I was just the next one. Yes, Jack said. That should be terrible, she said. And it is, but it's also, she searched for the word, clarifying, like something I was carrying turned out to not be mine. She looked up. Is that a strange thing to say? No, Jack said. It makes sense. I held my daughter tonight, she said, and I heard on her. She's so small. Something in her voice changed on those 3 words, shifted into a register that was different from everything else she'd said in the past 20 hours, softer and more absolute and more certain. She's so impossibly small, but she's perfect. Her fingers. A pause. I counted them. Both hands, both feet. Twice, the almost smile again, the one that kept arriving and nearly landing. The nurse thought I'd lost it. I told her I'd had a difficult week. Jack did smile at that. He couldn't help it. Grace noticed. You should do that more, she said. What? Smile. You've been running a war all day. You should be allowed to smile. I'm a biker, Jack said. We have a reputation. You carried a pregnant woman up an embankment in the dark, she said. I think the reputation can absorb a smile. He let it stay for a moment. Then it faded the way smiles fade naturally, not extinguished. I'm going to ask you something, Grace said. And I want you to answer me honestly. Okay. Is it really over? He looked at her. He thought about honesty, about the difference between the reassuring answer and the true answer, and about which one this woman who had spent years inside a carefully constructed set of reassurances that were all lies deserved. The immediate danger is over, he said. Nathan is in federal custody. His network is being dismantled. The evidence against him is solid enough that his lawyers aren't going to be able to make it disappear. He paused. But he has money. And money means resources, even in custody. And some of what he built will take years to fully dismantle. The investigation is going to be long. He held her gaze. What I can tell you honestly is that you are safe tonight. Faith is safe tonight. And tomorrow and the day after, you're going to have Roy and Patricia and federal law enforcement working to make sure that stays true. Grace listened to this carefully. Okay, she said. Okay. I've been living in a situation where the honest answer was always worse than what anyone would tell me. Getting an honest answer, even when it's complicated, is... She paused. It's a relief. Jack nodded. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. When this is done, when Nathan is convicted and the case is closed, and you've had time to when you're on the other side of it. He stopped. What do you want? Grace was quiet for a long time. I want to help someone else, she said finally. Someone who's where I was 3 years ago. Someone who doesn't know yet that there's a door. A pause. I know how it feels to be in a room where you can't see the exits. I want to be the person who shows someone where the door is. Jack thought about that. He thought about 22 men in a waiting room who had become, without planning it, the door. That's a good thing to want, he said. The morning came in slow, the way Montana mornings come in winter. Not dramatically, not all at once, but by degrees, the dark lightening one shade at a time until you realize, without being able to identify the exact moment it happened, that it was no longer night. Jack was still in the waiting room when the light changed. Most of the men were. A few had slept in shifts, a few had gone to get food and come back, 2 had gone home briefly and returned before sunrise. The room smelled like coffee and road leather, and the particular human warmth of people who have been in an enclosed space together for a long time and are past the point of pretense. Nobody had gone home. At 7:15, Roy came in with a legal pad and two phones and sat beside Jack. Marsh wants a formal statement from Grace as soon as she's physically able, Roy said. Patricia is coordinating. We're looking at this afternoon, maybe tomorrow morning, depending on how she's feeling. She'll do it today, Jack said. You sound certain. She's been waiting to say it out loud for years, Jack said. She'll do it today. Roy made a note. The Walker development assets are being frozen. The company holds are going to take months to sort through legally, but the personal accounts, Nathan's personal accounts, are frozen as of this morning. Grace's trust, the $42 million that was always legally separate, that's untouched. Good. She's also going to need to find somewhere to live. The house was his, Jack said. Technically both names, but given the circumstances, Patricia is filing to have his interests suspended pending criminal proceedings. Grace can stay there if she chooses, or not. Roy looked at Jack. She's going to have a lot of decisions to make in the next few months. She'll make them well, Jack said. Roy looked at him with the particular look of a man who has known another man for a long time and is noticing something he hasn't noticed before. He didn't say what he was noticing. He just went back to his notes. At 8:40, Sandra Reyes called from the crash site with her final report complete. She walked Roy through it in technical language that Jack followed well enough to understand that what she had documented was irrefutable. The combination of the severed seatbelt, the brake line tampering, the event data recorder showing deliberate steering input, and the trace evidence from Nathan's clothing collected by the FBI the previous night created a physical record that no defense attorney was going to be able to substantially challenge. What's her confidence level? Jack said when Roy ended the call. She said she's testified in 83 accident reconstruction cases, Roy said. She said this is in the top 5 clearest cases she's ever documented. She used the word definitive. Jack nodded. Then it's done, he said. The physical case is done, Roy said. The criminal proceedings are going to take... I know, Jack said, but the truth is done. Whatever happens in a courtroom from here, the truth is established and documented, and it doesn't go away. Roy was quiet for a moment. No, he said, it doesn't. Yeah. At 9:30, Jack went up to the NICU. He hadn't planned to. He'd been heading to the coffee machine and somehow ended up at the elevator, and then on the 3rd floor, and then at the window beside the double doors. He could see through the window. There were 6 incubators visible from where he stood. Small, enclosed, warm-lit, each one containing something impossibly fragile and impossibly determined. He couldn't tell from the window which one held faith. He didn't ask anyone to tell him. He stood there for 4 minutes. He thought about Danny Cortez, who had asked Jack 3 weeks before he died whether Jack ever thought about what he was leaving behind. Not what he'd built or what he owned. What he was leaving behind in people. Jack had said he tried not to think about it. Danny had said that was the wrong answer and laughed and then coughed and then laughed again. He thought about a girl who was going to grow up knowing that the night she was born, 22 strangers had stayed. He thought about what that would do to a person, what it would build in them. He thought it was probably something good. He went back downstairs. At 10:07, Marcus found him in the waiting room with a look on his face that meant news. Hatch broke, Marcus said. Jack looked up. An hour ago, an interrogation. He gave them everything. Names, dates, account numbers, the structure of the whole thing going back to Nathan's father. Marcus sat down. Marsh's office is calling it the most comprehensive voluntary cooperation they've gotten from a local official in 15 years. Why'd he break? Marcus was quiet for a moment. The agent told Roy that Hatch said he'd been carrying it since the first death, the boating incident. He said he'd known what Nathan Walker was from that point, and he'd kept taking the money anyway. He said he woke up every day for 11 years and told himself it was too late to stop. A pause. And then Marsh put Carol Merritt's files on the table in front of him, and he looked at them for a long time, and he said she had 2 kids. The woman on the boat, 2 kids and a husband who never knew. Jack was quiet. He said he wanted it on record that he was sorry, Marcus said, for what that's worth. Probably not much to the kids, Jack said. No, Marcus agreed. Probably not. The moment Jack had not expected came at 11:15. Patricia came to the waiting room and asked Jack to follow her, and she took him not to Grace's room, but to a small family consultation room 2 doors down, the kind of room hospitals maintain for conversations that need privacy, furnished with the careful neutrality of institutional empathy. Grace was there. She was in a wheelchair, which surprised him. He hadn't expected her to be mobile yet. She had a blanket over her legs and her left arm was in a soft brace, and she was pale the way she'd been pale since he first saw her. But she was upright and her eyes were the same clear, sharp blue they'd always been, and she had something in her arms. Faith was awake. Jack stopped in the doorway. The baby was tiny in the way that premature babies are tiny. Not the plump, settled weight of a full-term infant, but something more provisional looking. More provisional and simultaneously more urgent, as though she was working harder at existing than other people and intended to keep working at it. She had dark hair more than you'd expect. Her eyes were open and not focused on anything in particular, which was appropriate for a child 6 weeks early and 2 days old. Grace looked up when Jack came in. "I wanted her to meet you," Grace said. Jack didn't know what to do with that. He stood in the doorway for a moment, which was not something he did often. Jack Sullivan was not a man who stood in doorways, and then he came into the room and sat in the chair across from Grace. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," Grace said. It was becoming a pattern between them, that response. He was going to have to stop giving her openings for it. "I want to." Jack looked at Faith. Faith, in the impartial and slightly unfocused way of very new people, looked more or less in his direction. "She's beautiful," Jack said, and meant it with a simplicity that surprised him. "She is," Grace agreed. "She has her grandfather's forehead, my father's. I didn't know that until I held her." A pause. "She doesn't have anything of his. I've been looking." Jack understood what she meant by his. "Good," he said. "I've been thinking about what you asked me last night," Grace said. "What I want when this is over." She looked at Faith. "I keep thinking about the women who are where I was, before the will, before the lawyer, before any of it. When I was still telling myself it wasn't what it was." She looked up. "Somewhere in Montana right now, there's someone in that exact place. And she doesn't have a Jack Sullivan." Jack started to say something. "Don't," Grace said. I'm not saying you're a hero. I know you hate that. I can tell. I'm saying there's a gap between where someone is and where the help is. And I want to be in that gap." She paused. "I have $42 million that was supposed to go to a man who tried to kill me with it. I'd like to use it differently." Jack thought about that. "You'll need people to help with transport," he said. "Women leaving situations like yours, the first hour is the most dangerous. Getting from where they are to somewhere safe. That's the problem." "I know," Grace said. "That's something we could help with," Jack said. Carefully, not committing to anything specific. Feeling the shape of a thing without quite naming it yet. "I know," Grace said again, and something in her voice said she'd already been thinking about this for longer than the night. Patricia, from her position by the door, said nothing. But Jack noticed her write something on her notepad. So, at 2:15 in the afternoon, Grace gave her formal statement to Agent Marsh's team. Patricia and Roy were both present. Jack was not. That was not his place, and he knew it, and he stayed in the waiting room. But Marcus came back from a walk past the conference room at 2:40 and said that he could hear Grace's voice through the door and that it was steady the whole time, that it didn't waver. At 3:40, the agents left. At 4:07, Marsh called Roy. "She's the best witness I've ever taken a statement from," Marsh said. Roy relayed this to Jack verbatim because he knew Jack would want to know. "She remembers everything, dates exact words, sequence of events going back 4 years. She knew it was going to matter someday. She was keeping records in her head because there was nowhere safe to keep them anywhere else." "What happens now?" Jack said. "Preliminary hearings start in 6 weeks. Nathan's attorneys are going to try to negotiate. They always try to negotiate. Marsh says she's not interested in negotiating. She's going to trial on every count." Roy paused. "She said to tell you something." "What?" "She said, tell your client that what those men did staying in that waiting room, keeping her safe, securing that evidence that is going to be in the record. The federal record. Permanently." Roy looked at him steadily. "She wanted you to know that it mattered." Jack looked around the waiting room, at Marcus, who was on his third cup of bad vending machine coffee, at Martinez, who had fallen asleep in a plastic chair with his jacket over him, at the others, tired, unchanged, still in their funeral clothes from yesterday, 36 hours into something that had started as a quiet ride home from a cemetery. He thought about Danny Cortez. He thought about what Danny had asked him 3 weeks ago about what you leave behind in people. He thought he might finally have an answer. "Tell her we were just driving past," he said. Roy smiled. "I'll tell her." Roy called at 6 in the morning, 4 months after the night on Highway 12, and Jack knew from the first syllable that it was the call he'd been waiting for. "Jury came back," Roy said. Jack was already awake. He'd been awake for an hour, sitting at the table in his kitchen, with cold coffee and the particular stillnesses of a man who has learned that waiting is its own kind of work. He'd known the jury had gone in the previous afternoon. He'd been tracking it the way he tracked everything connected to Grace Walker's case, not obsessively, but consistently, the way you track weather when you know something important is happening outdoors. "All counts," Jack said. "Every single one, sir," Roy said. "Attempted murder first degree, conspiracy to commit murder." The federal prosecutors attached the 3 historical deaths to that charge, and it held. Domestic violence aggravated multiple counts, tampering with a vehicle, insurance fraud, wire fraud, money laundering. A pause, and in the pause, Jack could hear Roy breathing, and Roy Briggs was not a man who let his breathing be heard unless something had genuinely moved him. Jack, they convicted him on the 3 historical deaths. All 3. Conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, 3 counts. Jack set down his coffee cup. "How long?" he said. "Marsh is pushing for maximum on every count served consecutively. The judge has full discretion. Sentencing is in 3 weeks. Roy paused. "But Marsh told me off the record this morning that she's never seen a cleaner set of convictions, and she's never seen a defendant the jury liked less. She said the foreman actually asked her afterward if there was anything additional they could do." Another pause. "She told him he'd already done it." Jack was quiet for a moment. "Grace, no," he said. "Patricia called her at 5:50. I wanted to give them a few minutes before I called you." Roy's voice shifted into something quieter. "She cried, Jack. Patricia said it was the first time she'd cried since the night in the hospital. Through all of it, the depositions, the preliminary hearings, the trial, sitting in that courtroom for 3 weeks looking at the man who drove her off a mountain, she didn't cry once. She was the most composed witness Marsh had ever seen." A beat. "And then the verdict came in and she sat in that courtroom chair and she cried for 10 minutes straight." Jack pressed his hand flat against the table. He thought about composure, about the specific composure of a person who has held it together through the part that required holding together, and then when the holding is finally done, lets it go completely. He thought about the strength required to do that in sequence, to be exactly as strong as the moment needs and not 1 ounce more. He thought it might be the most impressive thing he'd ever witnessed, and he hadn't even been in the courtroom to see it. "How's Faith?" he said. Roy actually laughed at that. A short, real sound. "Thriving is the word Patricia used. 7 pounds, 4 ounces at her last checkup. Starting to smile." "She's 4 months old," Jack said. "They don't smile at 4 months." "Patricia says she smiles," Roy said. "I'm not going to argue with Patricia." Jack smiled. He was doing that more lately. He'd noticed. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with the noticing, so mostly he let it be. "I'll call Grace this afternoon," he said. "Give her the morning." "She might call you first," Roy said. "Just so you know." She did. At 9:43, his phone rang, and her name came up on the screen. He'd had it in his contacts since the 2nd week, which was something he hadn't told anyone because it was the kind of small thing that communicated more than he knew exactly how to say, and he answered on the 2nd ring. "Roy told you," she said. 6 this morning. "I cried," she said. "I heard. I'm not embarrassed about it." Her voice was clear and even, and slightly rough in the way voices get after crying, the good kind of roughness, the kind that comes from finally releasing something rather than from damage. "I thought I would be. I thought I'd spent so much time being composed in that courtroom that falling apart would feel like failure. It didn't." "It wasn't failure," Jack said. "No." A pause. "It felt like the end of something, not in a bad way, in the way that things should end, with the last door finally closing." She paused again. "Faith is wearing the yellow onesie Patricia bought her. She keeps grabbing her own feet. She seems very pleased with herself. She's 4 months old. She's advanced," Grace said, in the warmth in her voice when she said it was the warmth of someone who had come a very long way to be able to say ordinary things about their child in an ordinary voice and knew it and was grateful for it in a way that ran too deep for gratitude to be the right word. They talked for 23 minutes. They talked the way people talk when they have built something together over months of crisis and are now learning to talk to each other without the crisis as the framework. It was slightly different, slightly unfamiliar. But it was there the conversation finding its own shape. When they ended the call, Jack sat with the phone for a moment. Then he called Marcus. Verdict came in, he said. I know, Marcus said. Hector texted the group at 6:15. I've been waiting for you to call. Why didn't you call me? Because you needed to talk to Grace first, Marcus said. Obviously. Jack didn't say anything. Obviously, Tuan, Marcus said again with the particular tone of a man who has known another man for a very long time and has the standing to use that tone. How's the schedule looking for the 16th, Jack said. Good, Marcus said. Everyone confirmed. All 22. Tell them dress is the same as it was that night, Jack said. Whatever they were wearing on the ride home from Danny's funeral. A brief silence. Jack, Marcus said. It's right, Jack said. Tell them. The Faith House Foundation held its opening on the 16th of February on a Saturday in a building on the east side of Blackwood Falls that had been a shuttered community center for 6 years and was now, after 4 months of renovation funded by Grace Walker's Family Trust and 10 weeks of pro bono legal work by Roy Briggs and Patricia Howe, something else entirely. The building wasn't the story. Jack barely registered buildings. The story was who was in it. Grace was there, of course. She was wearing a dark green dress and her hair was pulled back, and she stood at the front of the room with Faith on her hip, 4 months old. Yellow onesie replaced now by something with small bears on it, feet in small knitted socks, wide-eyed and already trying to turn toward every sound and voice in the room, already paying attention in the specific alert way that suggested she had opinions forming, and she looked like someone who had been returned to herself. That was the only way Jack knew to think about it. Returned to herself. Like a thing that had been taken and then given back, and the giving back had not diminished it, had in some ways made it larger. Patricia was there. Carol Merritt had driven in from Garrison and was standing near the back with a cup of coffee and the expression of a person who has spent a long time not being believed and was still adjusting to the experience of being finally and definitively vindicated. Sandra Reyes, the accident analyst, had come. Diane, the night nurse, was there in her own clothes, which made her look both familiar and entirely different. Agent Marsh had sent a letter. Roy read part of it aloud, and the part he read said that the Faith House Foundation represented exactly the kind of outcome that made federal prosecution meaningful, not just removing a threat, but building something that made future threats less likely. Marsh said she intended to refer cases to the foundation when she encountered them in her work. She said she looked forward to seeing what Grace Walker built. And then there were the 22. They stood along the right side of the room and along the back in their riding clothes patches, visible exactly as they'd been the night on Highway 12. Not because Jack had made them dress that way as a statement, because it was true, because it was the accurate version of who they were and what they'd been when the thing happened, and truth Jack had decided somewhere in the past 4 months was the only currency worth carrying. Grace spoke for 18 minutes. She spoke without notes. She spoke about her marriage the way people speak about things they have fully processed and arrived at the other side of clearly, without minimizing, without dramatizing. Just factually and with the particular authority of someone who was there and survived it and had earned the right to describe it in their own exact terms. She talked about the years of isolation, about the way control works, not through constant violence, but through the architecture of dependence. The friends you stop seeing, the money you stop having access to, the version of yourself you slowly stop being able to find. She talked about the night on Highway 12, the way she told Jack in the hospital, with the specific detail that only an eyewitness carries the utility knife in the center console. The stars she'd been told to look at, the belt, going slack, the face of a man who was completely calm. The room was completely silent through all of it. And then she said, I'm not here to make you angry at Nathan Walker. He is going to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison, and that is exactly what should happen to him. And it doesn't require your anger anymore. It already required everything it was going to require. She paused. I'm here because right now in Montana, there are women who are living inside exactly what I described. They can't see the exits. They don't know the door exists. And what Faith House is, what we are, is the people who show them where the door is. And then we walk through it with them, and then we make sure the door is still there the next time someone needs it." She stopped. She looked at the 22 men along the wall. "When I was in that ravine," she said, "and I heard someone coming, I didn't know who it was. I didn't know if it was help or if it was Nathan coming back to finish what he'd started. I heard boots on gravel in a voice, and I made a decision in about 4 seconds, which is how long I had." She paused. "I decided to trust it, to trust the voice, to say what I needed to say before I lost consciousness, because if I didn't say it, then I might not get another chance." She looked at Jack specifically. "I want you to know that decision was the best decision I ever made. Not because of what you are, because of what you did." Jack held her gaze. He didn't look away, and he didn't let the thing that was happening in his chest show on his face, which required more effort than it usually did. "We're going to do something together," Grace said, "the foundation and the club. Because women leaving dangerous situations have a window. Sometimes it's a few hours, sometimes less, getting from where they are to where they need to be during that window safely. That's the hard part. That's the part where they can be found, where they can be stopped, where the danger is highest." She paused. "These men know how to move. They know these roads. They know how to put themselves between someone who needs protecting and the thing trying to harm them." She looked at the room. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather have in that window." The room started to applaud. The 22 did not applaud. They stood still, which was better than applause. Afterward, when the formal part was done and the room had broken into the smaller conversations that happen when a crowd exhales, Grace found Jack near the back wall with Faith on his arm. He hadn't planned for that to happen. She'd appeared beside him, and Faith had made the particular noise that 4-month-olds make when they want a different human. And Grace had said, without asking, "Can she?" And Jack had said nothing, which Grace apparently took as yes and transferred the baby. Faith looked at him. Jack looked at Faith. Faith, in the manner of someone still developing object permanence but already forming opinions, grabbed his finger. Jack looked down at the small hand wrapped around his index finger with the absolute certainty of someone who had not yet learned that things let go. He did not look up for a long time. "She does this to everyone," Grace said, standing beside him. "Patricia cried the first time." Roy pretended not to. "I'm not going to cry," Jack said. "I know," Grace said. "You're a biker. I have a reputation." "You carried a pregnant woman up an embankment in the dark," Grace said. "I think the reputation can absorb whatever is happening on your face right now." Jack looked up. She was smiling. A full smile this time, not the almost smile from the hospital, not the window opening and closing. A real one, the kind that changed her whole face, the kind that belonged to someone who had rediscovered something she'd thought was permanently gone. "She's going to know," Grace said. "Know what? Everything." Grace looked at Faith and then back at Jack. "When she's old enough to understand it. I'm going to tell her everything. The night, the ravine, the men who stayed. I'm not going to make it smaller than it was or softer than it was. I want her to know exactly what happened and exactly who was there." She paused. "I want her to know that when the world showed her the worst thing it had, it also immediately showed her 22 men who got off their motorcycles on a mountain road in the dark and did not leave." Jack said nothing. "She's going to know your name," Grace said. "She's going to grow up knowing your name." Jack looked at Faith. Faith still had his finger. He thought about Danny Cortez, who had asked him what he was leaving behind in people. He thought about the cemetery in Missoula and the formation on the highway and the ride that was supposed to be quiet. He thought about the gap between who you intended to be and who you turned out to be in the moments that counted. He thought he might finally be able to answer Danny's question. "I'd like that," he said. The sentencing came 3 weeks later. Nathan Walker received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge read each count and its corresponding sentence in a voice that was precise and without theater, the way judges read sentences when they are satisfied with their work and need nothing extra from the moment. Conspiracy to commit murder. 3 counts. Attempted murder, 1st degree. Domestic violence, aggravated. The fraud charges, the tampering, the corruption. Each one landed in the courtroom like something solid and permanent. Nathan Walker stood for it with his hands at his sides and his face in the professional calm that Jack had first seen in the hospital lobby and had read correctly. He did not speak when the judge asked if he had anything to say. His lawyers had advised against it, and for once in his life, Nathan Walker had taken advice. Grace was in the courtroom. She sat in the front row with Patricia beside her and Roy behind her, and she listened to every word of every count, and when the gavel came down for the last time, she sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up and she gathered her coat and her bag, and she walked out of the courtroom the way she'd walked into it, straight-backed, unhurried, with the particular authority of a person who is exactly where they're supposed to be. She didn't look at Nathan Walker, not once. Not on the way in and not on the way out. She had decided at some point that Jack wasn't aware of until she told him later that she would not give him her eyes. That after everything he had taken, her eyes in that courtroom were the one thing that remained entirely hers, and she was keeping them. Jack was waiting outside. He was with Marcus and Hector and Martinez and a dozen of the others standing on the courthouse steps in the February cold. They had ridden down from Blackwood Falls together that morning in formation, the same way they'd ridden everything for as long as Jack could remember. Grace came through the doors and saw them and stopped. For 3 seconds, she stood at the top of the steps and looked at them, and they looked at her, and nobody said anything. Then she said, "It's done." "It's done," Jack said. She came down the steps. She had faith in a carrier against her chest, bundled against the cold hat, pulled down, eyes open, and aimed at the world with the impartial curiosity of someone encountering everything for the first time and finding it interesting. Grace stopped in front of Jack. She reached out and put her hand on his arm briefly. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the gesture of one person acknowledging another person, the kind of touch that says, "I know you were there," without requiring the words. "Thank you," she said. "You already thanked me," he said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to keep doing it." Jack looked at Faith. Faith looked at him with her wide, impartial, opinion-forming eyes, and after a moment she produced the sound that Grace had told him about, the smile sound, the one that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a word, but was something between them, something entirely her own. Jack felt it somewhere behind his sternum. "She remembers you," Grace said. "She's 4 months old," Jack said. "She's advanced," Grace said in exactly the tone she'd used on the phone the morning of the verdict, warm and ordinary, and belonging entirely to someone who had come back to herself. Marcus, from behind Jack's left shoulder, said very quietly, "She's right, she does." Jack looked at the small face looking up at him. He thought about the night. He thought about a mountain and darkness and smoke and a faint sound below the guardrail. He thought about the exact moment he'd gone over the rail, not deciding exactly, just moving the way you move, when there's only one thing to do, and the only question is whether you do it or you don't. He thought about a woman in a white dress and hands pressed against an abdomen and eyes that were deciding in 4 seconds whether to trust him. He thought about what those 4 seconds had cost her. He thought about what they had given her. He thought about 21 men who had buried their brother and ridden home in the dark and were supposed to be home in their beds, who had instead spent 36 hours in a hospital waiting room in their funeral clothes because one of them had said, "We're not leaving," and none of them had questioned it. Not because they were heroes, not because they had decided to be anything in particular, because there was a woman who needed the door, and they were the door, and you don't close a door on someone who is still inside. He thought about Faith. He thought about what she would be told when she was old enough to understand it, about the night her mother was returned to the world, about the men on the mountain road, about the voice in the dark that turned out to be the right kind of voice. He thought about what that story would do to her, what it would build. He thought it was probably something that would last. The February wind came off the mountains cold and sharp, the way Montana wind always came, without apology and without ceremony, and the 22 stood on the courthouse steps with it moving through their jackets, and Grace Walker stood among them with her daughter against her chest, and not one of them moved. They stayed until she was ready to go. That was the whole of it. That was the story. Sometimes the people who look like danger are the only ones who stop. Sometimes the people who stop are the only thing standing between a woman and the darkness she married. Sometimes a child is born on a mountain road in the worst possible moment and grows up knowing that the world sent 22 strangers to be the reason she got to grow up at all. Nathan Walker would die inside a federal prison, and the empire his family had built on silence and fear would be scattered and returned to the people it had been taken from, and the judge and the sheriff and the paid men would serve their time and carry what they'd done. And none of that would undo the years Grace had lost or the 3 lives that had ended too early on a lake and 2 roads in rural Montana. But Faith Walker would grow up knowing her name meant something. She would grow up knowing that on the night she was born, the world sent her mother a door, and 22 men stood beside it and refused to move. That is what real strength looks like. Not the kind that buys judges and builds empires and controls everything it touches until the touch becomes a grip and the grip becomes a vice. Not the kind that is measured in money or fear, or the silence of people who owe you something. The kind that gets off a motorcycle on a dark mountain road because there is a sound below the guardrail, and the sound is human, and that is enough. That has always been enough. That will always be enough.